the most controversial, significant, and amazing claim ever made in the history of humanity is the one that says Jesus Christ was raised from the dead on Sunday after his crucifixion on Friday. But what does the Bible say? Is this a true claim? What about this spectacular claim that somebody was dead on a Friday and then back to life on a Sunday? Let's look at those claims and see what the Bible actually says. Now, if you know anything about me, you know that I am a classical apologist. Maybe you don't know anything about me, but if you know about my apologetic background, then you know that I am a classical apologist. So what is classical apologetics? Well, classical apologetics first wants to show, before we get to the Bible and before we get to the resurrection and all that, we want to demonstrate the existence of God so that we can put all of the miracles in a theistic context. Now, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to save that for a later show. So we're going to just assume, for the sake of argument, in this talk, that God exists, because that's going to be a pretty significant position to maintain. If you're an atheist, then the chances of Jesus coming back to life are a lot lower. As atheists will say, though, and some will maintain, it's not completely impossible, because there are actually other theories that atheists or people who are not Christians, or not Orthodox Christians anyway, classical Christians in theology, say that there are ways that Jesus could have come back without God. For example, I had some UFO videos out there and alien stuff. There are some groups that say aliens rose Jesus from the dead, and even some groups that say Jesus himself was an alien. So let's just, for the sake of this talk, we're going to assume classical theism is true, and we're going to look and see what the actual evidence is for the resurrection. All right, so what is the evidence for the resurrection? Let's get started. Well, there are some data points that need to be explained. One of them, as ridiculous as this sounds, is the fact that Jesus died. Why would we say that is something that has to be explained? No matter what theory you hold to, the Bible teaches these points, that Jesus died. The disciples believed they saw him after he was dead. The disciples were transformed, went out and were even willing to be imprisoned, beaten, and killed in some cases for their faith in Christ and his resurrection. That skeptics like Paul and James were converted, and that the tomb was empty. Okay, so why do we need to say that Jesus died? That doesn't seem like it needs to be a very big point. Well, there are some groups of people who say he did not die. For example, Muslims claim that Jesus did not die. Interestingly, in Islam, we are told that Jesus was born of a virgin. He lived a sinless life. He performed miracles, and he was taken bodily to heaven. That's not part of this talk. It's just extra, so no extra charge for that. So these are the points that we have to explain, that anyone has to explain, if they're going to investigate the resurrection, or if they're going to try to put forward an alternate hypothesis. So no matter what they hold to, they're going to have to make sense of these points here. Well, the first point's not very hard to explain or to prove, and I'm going to put aside the ridiculous, nonsensical notion that Jesus didn't exist. There are some people who say that Jesus never existed. That is just not really a viable option. There is just too much evidence. Even skeptics and agnostics, like Bart Ehrman, for example, argues that is just a ludicrous theory to say he didn't exist. So what's the proof he died? Well, he was crucified by Romans. They were professionals. He was beaten. He was crucified, and he had a spear thrust in his side. His death is recorded by all the Gospels, all the New Testament, all the eyewitnesses agree that he was dead. Early church fathers, non-Christian sources like Lucian of Seasada and Talmud, they say there's nothing in the first century among all those witnesses to contradict the notion that Jesus, in fact, died on Friday at the hands of the Romans, instigated by the Jews. And even critical scholars admit of his death. So there's really no question about his death. Interestingly, there was a medical journal in 1986 from the Journal of the American Medical Association, which says this, quote, "Clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge." So, what about the claim, for example, that Muslims make that Jesus was taken into heaven bodily without ever dying? Well, Islam is 600 years. First century, we have the events of Christ happening in the first century. So the Islamic faith sprouted in the 7th century. So we have 600 years between the events of the first century and the recordings of the Quran. Now, just from an historical point of view, we of course want to be as close to the sources and the events as possible. So we have every first century source, whether it's an eyewitness, whether it's a writing, other writings, non-Christian writings, non-New Testament writings, all agree that Jesus was dead. That shouldn't really be up for a debate. The Quran was 600 years later and is simply a fiat by Muhammad and a theological assertion, not based in history, but it's asserted that he didn't die. Jesus was dead on Friday. That is beyond historical dispute. Okay. The next point, and a major one, is that the disciples believed he had risen. And there are several places in the Bible. Every gospel records this. The epistles record this, so that the sermon in Acts records this. There's a famous creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that we're going to look at here in just a minute. But the first Corinthians 15 is the major chapter in the whole New Testament on the resurrection. And within the early part of that, the first few verses, we see a creed that dates back, what scholars say, to probably the mid-30s, maybe even just months after the events of the crucifixion and resurrection. Paul says this, 1 Corinthians 15, Galatians 2. The Gospels state this, that they believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Early church fathers say that they believed that they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Here's what 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 says. This is the English Standard Version. And the first few verses here are from this early creed. It says, this is Paul speaking, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I have also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that's Peter, "then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." Now, again, it is important to understand that the claims being made by the disciples were initially being claimed in Jerusalem. Now, where did he die and where was he said to be raised? Right in that same area, in Jerusalem, where they were claiming that he was raised from the dead. So if you're going to make something up, so some people say that these disciples are just making things up, and we'll look at the alternative hypotheses in a little bit. But if you're going to make a lie up about something so enormously fantastic as this, you probably aren't going to do it in the same town. There are too many people who are going to be there, who are going to be able to falsify a lie like that. So this is a significant point that they're saying this in Jerusalem. And so regarding this creed, we're told by scholars in this area of specialization that this is probably an Aramaic creed that goes back to the 30s, mid-30s, maybe even again months after the crucifixion and resurrection. Because again, this was mainly an oral culture in that they didn't really read and write. They would pass things down orally, not that they couldn't read and write, but most did not. And so the things like this would be passed down orally. And so this would be a creed that we're told is easier in Aramaic to kind of get the cadence and be able to remember what is said in this creed here. And then what's really important, so anybody can say, yeah, I believe that Jesus was raised. And of course, Peter and Paul and the other witnesses could easily have just said, I believe that we saw Jesus rise from the dead, and he was alive again on Sunday after he was killed on Friday. But what's not easy to explain is how their lives were transformed. They changed their traditions overnight, basically, from being good Jewish followers who made sacrifices in the temple, who worshiped on the Sabbath, who refrained from eating certain kinds of food. They changed their traditions. They worshiped on Sunday. They got rid of the sacrificial system. They did not follow the tenets of Judaism anymore because that was replaced by their faith in Jesus. They became fearless witnesses. Remember that just hours before this, the disciples were met with Roman guards in the Garden of Gethsemane. And when Jesus was arrested, they ran away. John hung around, Peter hung around, and he ended up denying Christ 3 times. So at first, the disciples were very scared. They were skeptical of what was going on. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't know what to do. And they were terrified. The person they thought was going to be their Messiah was being arrested and then killed. But they became fearless witnesses. They were willing to be imprisoned, to be beaten, and even to be killed in some cases. So this is a significant point that lends credibility to the resurrection accounts. If they were just making up the story that they had seen Jesus, then they would not have been willing to undergo such harsh penalties. Now, some people have said that, well, Muslims are willing to die for their faith. That actually is a point in favor of what I'm saying, because the Muslims who are dying for their faith today believe what they're doing it for. They believe that they are actually going to be rewarded in their Islamic faith. So that doesn't take away from the point that I'm making about the disciples believing in Christ. It just goes to show they really were sincere in trusting their belief in Jesus. Now, not only were the disciples changed in their behaviors and beliefs, so were skeptics, such as Paul and James. Both were skeptical. Something happened to them to make them believe. So the question is, what in the world happened to change these two skeptics' minds from, in Paul's case, actually contributing or approving of stoning and killing people who were Christians like Stephen? What happened that was so radical that changed his mind? Well, he claims he had a vision of Christ on his way to Damascus. The Gospels say that Jesus' brothers, which would include James, were unbelievers, John 7:5. But the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15 reports that Jesus appeared to James. And according to early church writings, James died a martyr. So something had to happen to make Paul and James reject their skepticism and embrace the resurrection of Jesus. Another point that has to be maintained or explained is the empty tomb. There's no mention of a body in the tomb ever in the first century. The earliest account that we have about a Jewish response to the resurrection is Matthew 28, and it doesn't deny the resurrection. It says that the disciples came and stole the body. We're going to come back and look at that in a minute, that the disciples stole the body. There's no mention of a body in the tomb. The earliest accounts, the disciples stole the body, and a resurrection implies an empty tomb. Now, there's some liberal theology going around today that Jesus was resurrected in a spiritual way, but not in a physical way. That doesn't make any sense. That wasn't the teaching of the day. So a resurrection implies an empty tomb. So the tomb was empty. There's no dispute about that in the first century. Any evidence to the contrary would have to come from the first century. So what about some alternative hypotheses? What are some other theories that people give to try to make sense of what we have going on here in the Gospels and the epistles? Well, we have several. One is the view that I have already rejected out of hand, saying that Jesus was simply a legend. There's simply too much evidence in the historical record to say that Jesus was merely legendary. That is not a viable possibility. And even skeptics, very few people hold this. I only know of one person that I can think of, Richard Carrier, who holds this position today. There have been others, but not very many, and those are not normally in the field, that's a field that's relevant to these studies, like New Testament or ancient history. The earliest, as I just mentioned, is that the disciples stole a body. So in Matthew 28, the text says that the disciples came and stole the body. Well, we have to ask ourselves, let's just assume for a second that the disciples did, in fact, steal the body. We have some questions we have to ask. One, we have to look and see what are the criteria that have to be met in order to make these accounts of the resurrection authentic. Well, one is they got to be early. So because the New Testament was written in the first century and the Quran in the 7th century, that rules out, from a historical point of view alone, the claims that Jesus, for example, didn't die. Well, we want early testimony. We want eyewitness testimony. And we have that here. We have many eyewitness testimony. We have multiple attestation. Well, we have embarrassing details. For example, regarding embarrassing details, we know that the disciples fell asleep while they were praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. We have Peter cutting off a guard's ear. We have Peter denying Christ. We have the disciples repeatedly not understanding or believing Jesus, and on and on. We have the women, for example, showing up at the tomb first, when in this culture that would have been embarrassing for the men, and you wouldn't have made that point up if it weren't actually true. So there's a lot of embarrassing details, and that's a mark of authenticity. We have unsympathetic sources. Like, for example, we have Paul, who at first was anything but sympathetic. He was one who was encouraging the death of Christians, and he was approving of squashing that movement. But yet he and James, something happened to make them actually renounce their skepticism and belief. We also see dissimilarity in the New Testament in terms of a criteria of authenticity. In other words, we would expect Jesus to say things like, I am the Son of God. He does make claims like that. But he also says things like, I am the Son of Man. And that's not something that we ordinarily would expect someone who's claiming to be God to say he's the Son of Man. Although the Son of Man, it can be argued from the Old Testament, like in Daniel and Ezekiel, actually was a claim of messiahship and deity. Also, for a story or a document to be authentic, it has to be plausible, and it has to maintain consistency. Now, regarding these other explanations, they're going to have to say that in comparison to the resurrection account, this other theory is more plausible, has explanatory scope, more of that, more explanatory power. It lacks disconfirmation and is less ad hoc. So what does all that mean? Well, explanatory scope just means how much of the data is explained. So if you've got, for example, we've got 5 points we're looking at, right? We've got Jesus was killed. His disciples say that they saw him. They were transformed. Paul and James renounced their skepticism, and the tomb was empty. So we're trying to figure out what's the best hypothesis for all these things that we think are historical in nature, given what the Bible says in the New Testament. Well, so explanatory scope would say that whichever theory explains the data, the historical accounts the best, has the most explanatory scope. Explanatory power is how well a theory explains the data. So if theory A explains the data better than theory B, then theory A has more or greater explanatory power. Lack of disconfirmation simply means that it doesn't have any inconsistencies or contradictions. And ad hoc, a Latin phrase meaning to this, literally just means that something is made up to explain the data or support the data, even if there's no evidence to support it. So if theory A was ad hoc, that means that it was provided just to save the day or give an account for the evidence, even though it doesn't have any evidence of its own. Now, let's go back and look at these. Remember these criteria for best explanation. You got plausibility, explanatory scope, explanatory power, lack of disconfirmation or inconsistencies or contradictions, and then being less ad hoc, or really ad hoc just means made up to save a theory. So again, we have legendary theory. That's just ridiculous. Even skeptics don't think that Jesus was legendary. Skeptics will think that he existed, but was not God. Disciples stole the body. Is that plausible? What could have happened? The disciples could have stolen the body first from a logical point of view. But does that explain their sightings? Well, they could have lied about it, so that maybe would have explained the sightings. But does it really explain their transformation and their willing to be imprisoned, their willingness to be beaten, scourged, and ultimately killed? I don't think so. I don't think that the disciples stealing the body really explains the data well. So I think the resurrection here has more explanatory scope and power and is less ad hoc than the disciples stealing the body. Plus, if the disciples stole the body, that means that there was a body, and it's likely that somebody would have discovered it and would have brought that out to light. How about they went to the wrong tomb? Well, that would explain the tomb being empty, but it would not explain the sightings that they said they had of Jesus, the encounters they had with Jesus. And it doesn't do a great job from an explanatory power point of view of explaining their transformation from being skeptical, from being scared, into being very, very bold and empowered to do what they did in terms of spreading the gospel and willing to be imprisoned, beaten, and killed. Plus, if they went to the wrong tomb, that means that Jesus was still in the tomb, and the Jews or the Romans or any skeptic could have come along and just showed them, hey, you went to the wrong tomb, he's over here. Swoon theory. Swoon theory is the notion that when the guard gave Jesus something to drink, the vinegar on that sponge, that they gave him some kind of a concoction to knock him out, and he regained consciousness on Sunday. Now, if you're like me, some of these theories just sound less believable than an actual resurrection. The swoon theory, remember what happened to Jesus. He was beaten, he was crucified, and then the spear was thrust into his side. I think the spear alone would have killed him, based on what we understand from medical knowledge, because it was pulled out. It says that water came out and then blood, probably either fluid from lungs or around the heart, followed by blood from the heart and other organs from the body. That alone probably would have killed him. But if he did swoon, he certainly would not come out victorious looking and glorious looking and all of that. He would come out, wouldn't have come out, he would have been found on the brink of death, as it were. That's just a silly theory. I don't understand how people hold to such theories. Hallucination theory is probably the most well-known theory or the most well-used theory, popular theory today, namely grief hallucinations. So a grief hallucination, as the name implies, is a hallucination that someone has because they are undergoing such grief that they hallucinate and believe that they're seeing somebody there who's not really there. Now, such things can happen. You can have grief hallucinations. So somebody can undergo such grief that they see their loved one. They believe they see their loved one, but it's really just a hallucination. So that does happen. That's been recorded and understood. The problem with that theory is, one, it doesn't explain the empty tomb. It doesn't explain the appearances to Paul and James. And it does raise serious questions about the fact that so many people had the exact same hallucinations simultaneously on 4 different occasions. And so while group hallucinations happen, especially in military environments where you're sleep deprived or you're doing a lot of training, you don't eat a lot, you don't sleep a lot, people can have group hallucinations, but they don't hallucinate the same thing. So in order for this theory to work, they would have had to have the same hallucinations, auditory, visual, and sensible in terms of being able to touch him. And that is just, there's nothing in record to support such a thing. And given all the evidence and the context, it seems like it's more likely the case, given the things Jesus was saying, and given that theism is true, and again, for the sake of argument in this podcast, that God raised him from the dead. And if they were hallucinating, the body still would have been there, and that would not have explained where the body went. There's another point that's oftentimes used today, and that is that the resurrection is borrowed from mystery religions. And while this is a popular belief, it doesn't match up with historical data because there is no other account of a resurrection like we see here with Jesus. While we do see other quote-unquote resurrection accounts, like Osiris, for example, they are much more mythical in nature, and they're not witnessed by people in the normal sense of what we see here with Jesus. So given the data, again, the 5 data points that Jesus died, the disciples claimed they saw him, they were transformed, Paul and James, who were skeptical, came to faith, and the tomb was empty. We have to explain those because these are very early documents. The New Testament writings that contain these accounts from both the Gospels and the epistles were all written in the 1st century. The dates that extend into the 2nd century for the New Testament have been debunked. And some of these books, like 1 Corinthians, for example, Galatians, are very early. Corinthians, for example, is well known even by skeptical scholars to date into the mid to late 50s, which is only about 20, maybe 25 years after the event. It's very, very close in the events regarding Jesus' death and resurrection. And let me give you a few resources to look at. There are a lot of books that I could give you and point you to. Let me just give you a few. Here's an old one, but a good one. Frank Morrison's Who Moved the Stone. You're probably familiar with The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Gary Habermas, who is one of the leading scholars on the resurrection in the world, his book with Michael Licona, another scholar in that area, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And another good book on the historical Jesus that shows that he existed and just some about him is The Historical Jesus, written again by Gary Habermas. And there is no shortage of good books on the resurrection, good debate books. Whelan and Craig, for example, has debated Garrett Ludeman. There's a lot of information out there on the resurrection. And I hope this was helpful for you. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. And I believe the resurrection is the best explanation for the data. And I believe Jesus was raised. And I believe he is who and what he says he is. Thanks for tuning in.